a lot of effort and energy is spent in helping folks prepare for these events, both, mentally, emotionally, physically, helping people endure and get through these events mentally, emotionally, physically. But then we've got to really leverage all of that afterwards and have folks really spend time being deliberately self-reflective about what they learned. So the tenets of experiential education answers this question of like, so what, now what? Right? Like, let me transfer, we call it transference, right? What I learned during this hard thing into my actual life.
Welcome to the Spartan Up podcast with Joe Sena, founder and CEO of Spartan Race.
We are talking about overcoming obstacles. The same way we teach people to get over obstacles on the course, we will teach you here on the Spartan Up podcast to get over obstacles in your mind.
You left your comfort zone. You embraced the struggle. Now what? How do you get the maximum leverage from these difficult experiences that you know will create growth? Sarah Goldman says the finish line is just the start. She explains the process of growth and, at the end of the episode, lays out the steps to take to ensure the incredible feeling you have at the finish line is integrated into your life.
This episode of Spartan Up is brought to you by Headspace. You deserve to feel happier, and Headspace is meditation made simple. Go to headspace.com/Spartan for a free 1-month trial with access to Headspace's full library of meditations for every situation.
Joe Sena here, founder and CEO of Spartan and the Spartan Up podcast. I've got Sarah Goldman. She is a program director for Outward Bound. If you don't know what Outward Bound is, I'm going to let her explain it. But it's basically like, a 1, 2, 3 week camp where you take kids out in the wilderness, stretch them beyond their wildest imaginations, and turn them into like adults.
Yeah, pretty much. And we work with, not just kids, but adults as well. Outward Bound utilizes what's called experiential education, which is very much like a Spartan Race, is experiential in nature. And we do that to achieve our mission, which is changing lives through challenge and discovery. Like the whole point is like creating these real novel, discomfort, challenging activities so that folks can like be different as a result.
We didn't talk about, I want you at our camp, Spartan Camp, which Outward Bound would probably never want to be affiliated with this camp because I'm just too crazy with the kids. We push them way too hard. It's more like the Marines would be a good partner for this camp. It's June 25th. We're only taking 30 some odd kids, but I need you there if you're willing.
Okay, I hear you.
Awesome. And it's on the farm in Vermont. So we're going to do that together. But what I found when I did this camp last year, and I wonder if you find this too, could you stretch a kid too far? Why do some people take that challenge, that obstacle, and turn it into like fuel, and others just crack?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think about stretching people too far, we talk at Outward Bound a lot about comfort zones, right? And people throw that phrase around a lot, like, oh, it's outside my comfort zone. It's in my comfort zone. You've got to be in those spaces, and there's 3 comfort zones. There's like you're green. I'm all good to go. I'm in my comfort zone, sitting on my couch watching TV, right? Their next zone is that like growing or growth zone, or people call that like your stretch zone, and that's outside of that, and frankly, like talking to you on this podcast right now, this is in my stretch zone. I'll take that, right? That's fair. I'm not sitting on my couch, but I'm here and I'm alert and I'm cognizant. When we get into that next zone, that's like that red, and I call that like the no-go zone. And that's like where people shut down and they stop learning, and they're in that like panic, I can't do it, right? So when you talk about like pushing kids or pushing adults, whoever's doing something too hard, yes, there's that space because you just stop learning. There stops being a benefit to it. So the like a great practitioner of challenge, a deliverer of challenge, finds that exact line for someone that is like, I'm still here, I can still function, but I am way over my skis, right?
People that are going through the zones, and you and I have to remember, Marion, who's in the background, who's the producer of this, you have to remember, I want to give that to our marketing department. And I could see like a digital ad where people get to click where they spend the most time. What zone? Is it the orange? Would it be orange or green? The green zone, right?
Like your comfort zone, like where you're just chilling out and you're like, yeah, totally, everything's okay.
It's even worse than the green zone. It's the gluttony zone.
Yeah, the gluttony zone, like that super comfort zone. And I think about that as also being the space where like your life is happening to you, right? Like you're a passive participant in what's going on as opposed to being like an active, like proactive person going out there. Because I think those are the people that you find that are in that like growth zone and that like next place outside of comfort.
And because a lot of people say to me, and they probably, in all your years of doing Outward Bound, they probably say like, why would I want to not be in the green zone? Why would I want to be in the uncomfortable zone?
Well, right. I mean, this is people who are like super comfortable with what they have in their life and they don't want anything more, or they're, satisfied with not learning anymore in their lives. I mean, obviously we've got to encourage folks and help them understand like why it's important to move into that area of discomfort and understanding that like that's where high performance happens too, right? So like high performance doesn't happen when you're comfortable. High performance doesn't happen when you're like super chill, stuff in your face, right? Like high performance happens when you're being pushed and when you're like expanded because you're engaged in such a different way. So if people don't want to improve their performance or don't want to improve their life, like, yeah, I can understand why they're not getting off the couch. And clearly we're seeing this. And Kurt Hahn, who was the founder of Outward Bound way back in the 1940s. Kurt Hahn was born late 19th century. He's got an amazing, crazy history of how he came to be. But even in the 40s, he had identified, and this is even in the 20s, actually, he had these schools in Germany. He's a German-born educator, kind of the father of experiential education. And he had the Salem schools in Germany, which he created to address what he called the 6 declines of youth, right? And this is 100 years ago, right? And he's identifying things like the decline of physical fitness, the decline of initiative and enterprise, the decline of memory and imagination, skill and care, the decline of self-discipline, and in his idea, like of the most was the decline of compassion, right? So he created these schools to address those declines. And you think about it, like that's 100 years ago. That is before everything. And we could say all of those things are still happening, right? 100%, right? Like the decline of physical fitness, and he said like it was a decline of physical fitness due to like modern locomotion, right? And the decline of skill and care was like the decline of craftsmanship and of quality, right? And so we focus on those things still today at Outward Bound of like trying to address those pieces. So yeah, trying to get folks to have and live better lives. I mean, that is what Kurt Hahn was doing, 80, 100 years ago.
That was before we had the disaster we have now. That was like, he would have to start a whole new concept of a school now.
I mean, I don't know. I think we do a pretty good job of like applying those classic principles like to today. And like when anyone comes on our courses, adults or not, my specific job at Outward Bound at North Carolina is I work with Outward Bound Professional. So I deal with adult intact teams. So corporations, businesses, law firms come to me. We spend a week in the wilderness. They don't bring their phones. They are, potentially running what we call a PCE, a personal challenge event. They're running a 5-mile run. They're sleeping on the ground. They're cooking their food. So I think we use those classic principles still, right? Now, Outward Bound, Kurt Hahn had these like declines of youth, coming into the creation of Outward Bound, but Outward Bound was created in order to solve this problem during World War II, where in the UK, merchant marine ships were being attacked by U-boats during World War II and sinking, and the sailors on those weren't surviving. And so one of Kurt Hahn's students, Lester Holt, his father, Lester Holt, had this Blue Funnel shipping company that he owned, and he looked at Kurt Hahn and he said, you got to help my guys survive, right? You got to help these guys survive these things. And it wasn't because they didn't have the technical know-how to do it, right? It's because they didn't have the interpersonal skills. They didn't have the like perseverance, the grit, the resilience. They didn't have any of those things that we're trying to teach today. And so Outward Bound exists in order to like help, Marines that were getting sunk by U-boats survive. Right. So that's like the foundation. Like that is where in 1940 Outward Bound began. It came to the United States, 25 years later. But it's just those classic principles still totally apply. And whether we're talking to a 13-year-old middle schooler or I'm talking to a 65-year-old senior partner in a law firm, same thing.
We got to survive the U-boats. I like it.
Right. And not just like got to know how to, do fire by friction, right? We've got to like know what actual grit feels like. We've got to know what perseverance feels like, those things, right? How to work in a team, right? So that's like one of the things that I think I'm curious how you're going to make this work with your Spartan camp and how it worked last summer. But like for us, one of the key elements, right, is that teamwork piece, right? And so Kurt Hahn talked about this idea of spectatoritis, right? Of like, this is again, 100 years ago, of people like stepping back and looking at things happening. Well, on an Outward Bound course, you come in and you're part of a crew, right? Like the crew like is above all else. And so you can't be a spectator. You've got to be involved. So that team dynamic is like the big piece. Angela Duckworth, who I know you know, and like her work is amazing. She was a part of an Outward Bound Canada program, and she was talking to us about Outward Bound and has said that like Outward Bound has the like magic, like we've got the magic formula for like teaching grit and perseverance, because we have all that challenge and all these things, then we put it in this like team setting. And it just like, it's the thing, right? And so for me to hear her like really kind of say that we figured it out is awesome. And what's crazy is that it got figured out, 80 years ago.
Yeah, it's just shocking, right, that 80 years ago that we would feel like people were soft. So I guess with every passing generation, we just get softer.
Softer, or it just, I guess it's all relative, right? I mean, but at the same time, it's more just that like, that's just a classic idea, right? That we've gotta seek out intentional discomfort. Like we have to, voluntarily pursue stuff that's hard. Like we've got to do that, right? In order to not be soft.
I just visualize like a pack of wolves, and maybe one of the brothers or sisters within the wolf pack somehow got into a house, and the house had a fire and meals, right? And
Totally.
The other wolves were all outside looking in and saying,
Totally.
I mean,
I'm a dog person, like full on, me and my dog were together all the time. And I love dogs. And then sometimes I laugh because I'm like, oh, we did this to you, right? Like I made you want to sit on this futon. You should be out like roaming around doing all kinds of crazy stuff, but you really like to sleep for 20 hours a day on my futon. And I'm like, I'm sorry we did that to you.
We learn helplessness, and we do that for everybody around us, right?
God, learned helplessness is one of the most frustrating things I think I'm like working up against these days. Yeah. It's like undoing some of that wiring for folks, right? And so, yes, if we can get somebody at 16, like what an amazing time to influence them. But I think we also discount the opportunity we have to influence adults, right? I mean, and think about what you're doing with your races, right? Like those are majority of adults having this potentially transformative life experience, right? We do that at Outward Bound with adults. And it's because, I mean, while adults don't have the same malleability as kids, right? Like they don't learn in the same ways. They still have like different life experience to call on, which makes a huge difference for them in a different way. So I think it's cool to be able to do that like across the spectrum.
I like kids better just because I feel like they're wet clay and they're a little easier. I get a lot of billionaires that send me their kids, but they're 20 to 25 years old, and it's just harder at that point to take. It's harder to take the dog out of the house at that point and say, now go get your own food, when for 21 years somebody's been like clipping your nails and giving you meals, and
sure.
Oh, you don't like that meal, I'll give you a new one. Oh, you don't like that one, I'll give you a third one.
Yeah, but if you can find the space in their life where they're dissatisfied and lean into that, and I think that's one of the things that I think we do really well is that we create these environments of like emotional and psychological safety, like these places where you can get somebody to finally admit like, yeah, this part of my life sucks and I want to fix it. And so as an adult, where like maybe a kid wouldn't say like, this part of my kids are very aspirational, right? Like, oh, I want to be this and I want to do this. And that's great. You can like you said, mold that clay and set them on that path. Well, like with an adult, if you can get them to admit that like, yeah, I really hate this part of my world, right? Then you can start to address that, and you can try to see if they want to make changes in that space. But you've got to create that culture and that environment where you can get them to admit that, right?
Why to that point, when we look at like 1.5 million people a year pre-COVID signing up for events and then getting stories like, I lost a bunch of weight, I'm back with my husband, I'm back with my wife, I'm back at school, I have a bunch of children, I'm a single mom, and now I started a business. all it is a bunch of obstacles, barbed wire, and mud. Like, why? How could that have such a profound effect across so many different types of problems?
We'll be right back to the interview, but first I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Headspace. Meditation sounds great, right? So many of the guests we interview on the podcast have talked about the benefits. Mark Devine, Andrew Huberman, behavioral psychologist Rebecca Heiss, Ariana Huffington, but it's not easy. Today's sponsor, Headspace, is changing that. You probably tried meditation before and it didn't work, right? Or maybe you felt like you were doing it wrong. If mental health is part of your plan, and it should be, you owe it to yourself to try Headspace. Imagine your own little pocket-sized guide that helped you sleep better, focus better, and perform at a higher level. It exists, and if you have 10 minutes, Headspace can change your life. Meditation can help with burnout, with stress, even mood. Headspace has data to back it up. Check out the numbers. 4 weeks of Headspace can increase focus by 14%. Only 3 weeks of use has been shown to cut aggression to negative feedback by a whopping 57%. That's huge. And with Headspace, you can be 28% less sad in just 10 days. You deserve to feel happier, and Headspace is meditation made simple. Go to headspace.com/Spartan. That's headspace.com/Spartan. And you'll get a free 1-month trial with access to Headspace's full library of meditations for every situation. This is the best deal they offer right now, so just do it. Head to headspace.com/Spartan and check it out. Okay, back to the interview.
All it is a bunch of obstacles, barbed wire, and mud. Like, why? How could that have such a profound effect across so many different types of problems?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it comes back to, and I'm going to continue to bring things back to Outward Bound just because, I mean, it is who I am too. Like, I have my entire life history is around Outward Bound. But Kurt Hahn said, there is more in us than we know. If only we can be made to see it, then perhaps we'll never settle for anything less. And I think what happens to somebody on a Spartan race, what happens to somebody when they like go after this challenge and they complete it, is that they see it. They now have seen and know with irrefutable evidence that there's more in them than they know. And then they won't settle for anything less, right? And so I think that's, you move the needle. I think we think about these like seminal life experiences, right? You can probably look back in your life, and I know I could probably even name some of them, having listened to, you know, your history quite a bit, where you can be like, yeah, man, my life changed that day, right? Like you think about that, and it's like, yes, in this moment, I know this thing happened and that changed me because now I've seen something I can't unsee, which is that I now know there's more in me than I knew. And I don't want to settle for anything after that, right? So I think that's how those things have that impact on folks. You're creating, I mean, I have been a huge fan of Spartan for years now. And I think what I've really always appreciated is that you're creating that experience for people and you've made it accessible. I think Outward Bound does that in a different way, and it's as accessible. It's just, different, obviously. But I think that is creating those experiences, providing that opportunity for somebody to step into that challenge and then learn from that challenge is, as you know, completely transformative for people.
So at the camp this summer, this Outward Bound-esque camp I did during COVID, I had a bunch of kids on the farm, and I took it well beyond where Kurt, your founder, might have taken it, right? I had the kids carrying rocks. They're up at 5:30 in the morning getting screamed at by a mountain warfare drill sergeant. It wasn't a lot of fun. I actually they have less and less food each day. I want them to get used to less and less food. They got to wake up earlier and earlier each day. And they cried, and unbeknownst to me, they texted their parents and said, break us out of here, Mom, Dad, this is craziness. But by the end of it, they transformed. I'll tell you one crazy thing you probably saw already is one night we felt bad and we said, you know what, they've worked really hard. Let's give them some ice cream. They really wanted ice cream. And in that same moment, we put their phones out for use. None of the kids went for the ice cream. They all went for their phones. And I was like, oh my God, the phones are more addictive than sugar, right? That's a lesson. But what do you think happened during that process? That at the end, they not only loved it, they saw the transformation of themselves, but they want to come back and experience that, for lack of a better word, pain.
Yeah, I mean, I think people crave, kids, whoever crave like authentic experience. Like it's a very authentic, real, germane, tactile, elicits all kinds of emotional and intellectual response. And so I think that's what's happening. You know, obviously we see sort of the same arc in our crews, right? And in our kids that come, you know, that first night we go to lay down and we sleep under tarps. We don't sleep in tents. Like we don't, you know, they sleep on a 1/4 inch, you know, foam mattress. And normally every night, that first night, you start hearing somebody, right? You got the sniffles for sure. And people want to leave and people want to go home. You know, that is absolutely, you know, I'm going to resist that pain, right? That's that whole thing, right? And I think you come to this level of like almost acceptance or giving in, right? Which is like a part of that arc of like, oh, I guess I'm here. So now I'm going to accept it. And I think like all hard things, you know, I've personally, you know, been through like a police academy, a fire academy. It's like that level of like challenge normalizes at a point. Right. And I think that 7-day program, you've got 2-3 days where it's like, holy crap, what's going on? And then it's like, okay, well, now this is normalized for me. And now even I've enjoyed it and I've had fun. And it's like the whole type 3 fun thing, right? Where it's like, it doesn't sound like fun in the moment. It's not fun in the moment, but gosh, talking about it afterwards is super fun. And I can't wait to do it again. I mean, that's classic. That's any of us that participate in any kind of sports like this. It's total classic type 3 fun. It's interesting, you know, you mentioned it about the phone because you know, we take all of our electronics away from students as well, which like getting them to understand that there's cameras that aren't actually attached to a phone is very hard for them sometimes because we're like, don't worry, we have cameras. But what's really cool is after long courses where these crews have been together for, you know, 14, 21, 28 days, they get their phones back. And I have seen this happen more than one time. They've been like, let's not look until we get to the airport. And they don't get on their phones right away. Like they are like, they don't want to. Like they admit to us repeatedly, you know, after extended period of time that they're like, yeah, it's actually awesome that I'm not on Instagram, you know, I'm like Facegram, Instabook, whatever it all is, right? I don't know. But they come to us worried about their like snap streaks. And then halfway like through it, they're like, God, you know, it's actually really nice to not have it. You know, so I think that's always really rewarding to hear that because it's crazy how addictive it is. I mean, us too. I willingly admit that I have issues with social media. I'm not going to pretend that I don't. But you know, that
happens to the best of us.
It does.
So give us some tips, couple of tips, 3 tips. I mean, you've done Outward Bound forever. You clearly have a Spartan mindset, Police Academy and Fire Academy. 3 tips for being a high performer, just getting after it and just getting the most out of your life.
Yeah, well, I think here's my tips, right? Is obviously like continue to seek voluntary discomfort, right? Like the deliberate pursuit of stuff that's hard. Absolutely. But I think what's the most important is that when you've had that hard experience, a Spartan race, an Outward Bound course, when you've just gone through life, right? Like when you know, enduring something hard has happened to you, not something you've sought out, right? Whatever it is that you've got to have first like a mindset shift around that. You've got to have, you know, in mindset, that word that we all throw around, but right, for everybody, you know, mindset is attitude. Let's just like call it your attitude. You've got to have an attitude change about the completion of that event. The finish line has to become the start line, right? So the finish of a Spartan race is not great. That experience is over. I learned what I did about myself and it's done. It's like, no, this is the beginning of the next part of your life, right? So when we talk at Outward Bound, when an Outward Bound course ends, we say, hey, you're now going outward bound. When you leave us is actually when your outward bound course starts, right? So first you've got to change your mindset about like these events and understand that like the finish line is the start line for everything, right? And then the next thing like in this piece is that you've got to be like highly intentional and very deliberate around the self-reflection that you do following one of these challenges. You know, a lot of effort and energy is spent in helping folks prepare for these events, both, you know, mentally, emotionally, physically, helping people endure and get through these events mentally, emotionally, physically. But then we've got to really leverage all of that afterwards and have folks really spend time being deliberately self-reflective about what they learned. You know, so the tenets of experiential education answers this question of like, so what, now what, right? Like, let me transfer, we call it transference, right? What I learned during this hard thing into my actual life, right? So taking, you know, this is like, it can look like a lot of different things. It can look like journaling. It can look like meditating. It can look like, you know, having conversations, but you're trying to answer the question of like, what did I just learn about myself, right? Like, what did I just do? What did I just find out? and then connect the dots, right? Like, okay, I found out that I actually, we can go back to I have more than me than I know, but we can also say that like, I actually am pretty perseverant, or I got some resilience out of this. Where can I apply what I just did? How does me carrying this heavy bucket up a muddy hill in the pouring rain, with people all around me, how does that translate to my relationship with my partner or my business relationships? Like, how do those things work? Like, sit down and connect the dots, like figure it out, right? Understand that you're like, okay, I could do this thing. How does this thing apply in these other situations? I think the other thing you've really got to look at is like, what would I have done differently in that space? And where's my opportunities to continue to grow from that, right? So that self-reflection is both looking at confirming the great things that you learned, but also like, oh yeah, I sucked at this. And I need to like, whether that's emotionally, mentally, or physically, this is something I've got to address, right? So I think that self-reflection is the key tenet and the key hallmark and difference of like experiential education. And I think that's like the key way that you leverage the challenge for that growth and leverage the challenge for the discovery. And then the next thing, right, it's keep the flame alive, right? Like attach yourself to the emotions and attach yourself to everything that you learned and like, don't let that go away. And this, going back to like Angela Duckworth, she talks about grit is like that extended interest, right? Like it's not just, oh, I did this for a year and that was cool, right? Or 2 weeks or whatever it is. It's like, no, I did this for 5 years, for 10 years, right? Like that's actual grit. So how do you keep that sustained interest over time? And like, there's lots of ways to do that. I think one thing that's really cool is you pay it forward to yourself. Right. So we utilize at Outward Bound, we call them 6-month letters. Right. So after we send our kids on solo too. So this is actually a really cool thing that Outward Bound, very specific to Outward Bound. We put 14-year-olds out in the wilderness by themselves for 2 nights, 3 days, give them very little food. Odd times we offer them the opportunity to fast because that's in the tradition of Outward Bound is to fast during that time. We check on them. We don't interact with them, but we'll like check on them in their solo sites and they're directed to be in their little 10 by 10 space for that time. And they get a journal. We give them their backpacks most of the time. But really they get water, they get a little bit of food and they get a journal and they get 3 days by themselves and they're 14, During that time, we ask them to write 6-month letters. And we're saying, hey, we want you to write a letter that we are going to send to you 6 months from now. And I talk about that as like, hey, this is your like strong self preparing for your future weakened state, right? So you finish a Spartan race and most people are like, hell yeah, I just did a Spartan race. Hell yeah, I just finished a 28-day Outward Bound course. I'm on top of the world. I feel great. I'm connected to all the good things that I am, all those things. Great. Sit down and write yourself a letter, write yourself something that when you don't feel that way, when you need to recall it, you can read that, right? Like we're our own best teachers half the time, right? So really when you're in that strong place, like pay it forward to your future weakened self and like prepare for that time, right? And then just last, like use symbols and rituals. I mean, I think what's so cool about Spartan, about Outward Bound, we utilize the Blue Peter, which is actually, it's right here behind me, but it's the flag that sailors fly when they are going outward bound, like when their ship is leaving safe harbor. And so we utilize that as a symbol, right? And it's just this blue and white square and everybody like attaches to that. I think your Spartan helmets everywhere, right? I raced last weekend and it was crazy because there were lots of Spartan athletes there and there were multiple vehicles that had their stickers on them. There was people wearing socks and it's just like, people attach to those symbols and attach themselves to rituals and that keeps that flame alive, right? And keeps you attached to that. So, it's about changing that mindset about your finish line, being the start line. It's about that intentional self-reflection and it's about keeping the flame alive. And I think that's how you leverage the hard stuff for even more. I mean, it's great you went out and did it. It's great you prepared for it, but you can do so much with it going forward.
I love that. You nailed it. And all you got to do, I guess the big mess, all you got to do is do something hard and then let it stick with you.
Yeah, I think we really do. Let it stick with you and find those ways to deliberately connect those dots to the life you're currently living.
And I'm going to see you on the farm.
I would love to get up there, Joe.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Spartan Up Podcast. Spartan Up is your partner in resilience for mind, body, and spirit. We're here 3 days every week. Tuesdays, you can find Joe Sena, founder and CEO of Spartan, interviewing biohackers, business leaders, authors, and athletes. Thursdays and Saturdays, catch episodes from our DECA, endurance, trail, Combat, and Laruta series. Do you know someone who needs a little nudge? Maybe they could use some motivation, tactics to be stronger, healthier, happier, more successful. Tell them about our show. And if you're watching on YouTube, leave us a comment. We want to know who's watching and who's listening. Thanks. See you next time. This episode of Spartan Up is brought to you by Headspace. You deserve to feel happier, and Headspace is meditation made simple. Go to headspace.com/Spartan for a free 1-month trial with access to Headspace's full library of meditations for every situation.